Hello, this is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for World History, chapters 29 and 30, dealing with the Far East and the beginnings of the Cold War. So, as we go along, make sure you have your guided notes so that you can put your information in. Here we go. The last time we were together, we were talking about the end of World War II. And when World War II ends, we almost have literally overnight the beginnings of what is known as the Cold War, which was actually kind of a stalemate between the West, which would be like the United States, and the free nations of France and Great Britain in Western Europe, and that of the Iron Bloc, or the Soviet Union and its allies. So, as we go along, fill in here. Number one, before World War II, Korea was ruled as a colony of Japan. And when the war ends, the Japanese obviously are in a position where they're going to have to give up some of their territory. At the same time, in 1949, the communist forces do take over China. And we mentioned this a few days ago when we talked about the rise of Mao Zedong. Um, Nearby, Korea, which is basically a peninsula off the coast of China, um, the northern part of that nation kind of became under the influence of the communists. So after the war, the United States occupied Korea south of the 38th parallel, which is almost like where this dotted line is, or if you see this line of latitude south of that line. Well, north of that was occupied by the Soviets or communist forces. In 1950, the armies of North Korea invaded South Korea, and the United Nations, which was established after the Second World War, and at that time selected General Douglas MacArthur, who we mentioned the other day, that MacArthur had been stationed in Japan after the end of World War II to help rebuild that nation. Because he was in the neighborhood, he was chosen to lead the UN forces that were able to work with the South Koreans to push back the communist forces that were coming from the north. This would go on for a few years. The war in Korea basically was a stalemate. Um, General MacArthur got a lot of criticism because he had basically threatened to use nukes to rapidly end this war. He actually had gone a little too far as pushing troops and was tempted to move across the border into China, which at that time was not necessarily something that the United States government desired to do. So in 1953, there was an agreement, basically an armistice, that would allow the fighting to stop, and it eventually divided Korea again at the 38th parallel. So this war kind of begins and ends in the same spot. Moving on, chapter 30. The United States, after the war, Second World War, refused to recognize the People's Republic of China, which was under the leadership of Mao Zedong, and they claimed that Chiang Kai-shek and his government was actually the true government of China. When Mao and his followers take over China and establish the communist regime, Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalists were actually forced from the mainland and ended up on the island of Formosa, which today is known as Taiwan. Number two, Mao Zedong instituted what was known as the Great Leap Forward. An idea was to increase China's agricultural and industrial output. Many educated Chinese were sent to the rural parts of the country to learn how to raise crops, or others were sent into the factories. And what ends up happening is kind of an economic catastrophe. Uh, Agriculture didn't necessarily thrive, and industrial output wasn't necessarily as good as maybe Mao had thought. And in time, we end up having, a situation where people are finding themselves very hungry. What's interesting is the propaganda that was coming out of China. The Chinese government depicted that everybody was receiving a lot of produce and they were eating well, as you can see in this kind of painting or poster. all the potatoes and onions and such. But the reality was probably closer to these pictures. You have children who were begging for food, who looked very emaciated, very skinny in that regard. In some cases, there are stories where there was so little grain that children and adults were seen scavenging through manure, looking for discarded grain that was given to livestock. So it was pretty bleak, when you talk about the situation that the Chinese public was facing. And number three, Mao ordered executions of hundreds of thousands of Chinese citizens because he feared that opposition, and he was a little bit paranoid. Matter of fact, there were people that were actually original supporters of Mao who found themselves arrested and sent to jail. And what's kind of sad is that the Chinese government did such a good job of brainwashing their children that a lot of times children would turn their parents in and their parents would be taken away. As you can see, these children that are in this photograph here, they all have these little books in their hands. This was known as the Red Book. And this is kind of what Mao believed was the center of the Chinese education, that every child would be able to memorize this book and to read from it, and they would learn everything that they needed to know about their Chinese history and what they needed to go on to be productive members of society. Number four, as a result of the Great Leap Forward, many factories and farms failed to produce enough, and there was widespread famine. And it was not a really, a great leap forward as much as a great step backwards. In the years following, in the 1950s and early 60s, Mao would introduce new programs. And one of his next ones was called the Cultural Revolution. The purpose of the Cultural Revolution was that Mao was trying to regain some power and prestige that he lost during the Great Leap Forward. Uh, China became completely isolated as a result of Mao's harsh treatment of his citizens, and as a result of the failure of the Great Leap Forward, other nations, including the Soviet Union, began to criticize him, further isolating the nation. Relationships between the two countries broke down completely by the 1960s. And again, you can see these kids with their red books in their hands. Even some of the leaders have their red books. In the years since Mao's death, China has passed many reforms that have dramatically improved the economy and the standard of living for a lot of Chinese and increased Chinese participation in the world economy. There's been some hiccups along the way, and there's a lot that China can do maybe to improve that situation as time goes on. In 1989, there was an event that took place at Tiananmen Square, which is kind of like the equivalent of the mall in Washington. At Tiananmen Square, a lot of young protesters showed up to demonstrate for democratic reforms. And this is about the same time that the Iron Curtain was kind of being chipped away in Western Europe or Eastern Europe. And these young people basically occupied Tiananmen Square for about a month. They actually made their own equivalent of their Lady Liberty, a paper mache statue here that you can see with the students kind of working around it. And then further back here, you can see the statue again. Kind of moving back to your reading here, as a result, the government eventually turned the troops out on these protesters, and many people were killed in Tiananmen Square. Frustration caused world leaders to call for force, but unfortunately, the military did not issue any kind of warnings, and a few shots were fired, and the next thing you know, you had the full force of tanks and troops moving in. In the photo down here, you can kind of see a man that's kind of standing in this row, in front of the row of tanks. In history, we call him Tank Man. And his story was pretty unique. When this event broke out, CNN was broadcasting almost 24/7 what was going on. And this man kind of comes out of the crowd and he stands in front of the tanks to kind of stop them from moving in. The thing that's kind of interesting here is, and maybe a little bit sad, is that we've never learned the identity of this man. And there's a pretty good chance that this man was arrested and probably executed. Many of the leaders in this demonstration spent time in jail. Moving onward, in 1997, the city of Hong Kong, which actually had been part of the British Empire, finally became part of China. This was a huge, huge opportunity for the Chinese because Hong Kong had a well established stock market, and all that now becomes part of the Chinese economic system. All right. Last part here, section 4, the rise of Pacific Rim economies. After World War II, Japan's citizens gained many new civil rights. You had a brand new democratic government that was established, new political parties were formed, the economy grew, and the standard of living improved greatly. General Douglas MacArthur was given control of occupied Japan. One of his duties, as I mentioned earlier, was to establish a constitution that went into effect in 1947. As we move through the years, the work ethic of the Japanese people contributed a lot to their own recovery and their strong economic performance. Companies like Mitsubishi, who had been basically developing aircraft during the Second World War, started manufacturing automobiles. So before World War II, the Japanese economy had been more light economy, but after the war, they focused on building a heavy economy or heavy industries such as the automobile manufacturing industry. And eventually you have companies like Honda and Toyota, Mitsubishi that kind of come to the forefront. In Korea, things were not so happy. Kim Jong il, the leader of North Korea, his son, Kim Il Jung, is the son of leader Kim Il sung, who is this man here. Um, Kim Jong il, a while back, passed away, and now his son is now the new leader of North Korea. North Korea's economy is different from that of the South. In that the communist North economy has deteriorated while the South's economy has improved. The U.S. has also helped improve the South Korean economy, and it's one of the most thriving economies along the Pacific Rim. The Asian tigers, they help develop in order to provide their citizens with education and training in South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore. The Asian tigers took advantage of economic aid from the United States and focused on producing goods for export. Last item, the financial crisis of 1997 resulted in foreign companies investing heavily in the Asian tiger economies. And part of that was a lack of government regulations that led to problems. So banks began to fail. All right, well, thank you very much for paying attention, and I hope you have a great day.